I should never have returned to that apartment complex. The initial instance was sufficiently harmless. My realtor had given me a list of communities to look at on my own time when I was house looking in a place I had recently moved to for business. Riverside District was listed as up and coming, which I would later discover was jargon for gentrifying quickly while still being somewhat gritty. It caught my attention on a Sunday afternoon as I was driving past. Standing alone on a corner property is a 6-story masonry building with plywood covering the majority of the windows. I noticed something about it. The architecture might have been the cause. It had a vintage 1920s vibe that is hard to get these days. Or it might have been morbid curiosity. In any case, I stopped. Although the front door was locked shut, I could see that someone had been slipping in because the chain was so loose. There was a space, just big enough for a human. Normally, I wouldn't trespass, but the structure appeared to be utterly abandoned. An empty shell with no cameras, no security signs, and no signs awaiting renovation or demolition. I got away with it. The lobby was just what you would have expected. Rot and mildew odors, broken mailboxes, and peeling wallpaper. The floor was cracked tile, and my footsteps reverberated through the cracks in the shuttered windows. Afternoon light sliced the blackness into stripes. In the hopes of creating an intriguing Instagram post, I snapped a couple pictures with my phone. You know, urban degradation. I tested each step before placing my weight on it as I made my way to the second floor. The inside of the apartments were gutted, and most of the doors were open. Someone had red spray paint onto the wall in one unit that read "Remember Me." Another had a shopping cart full of newspapers that had been wet by the rain. Typical items from an abandoned building. The third floor is where I first saw the odor. This time, no mildew or decay. Another stuff, almost domestic, as if someone had been cooking. I listened while standing motionless in the corridor. Aside from the distant sound of traffic outside and the wind blowing through the damaged windows, the building was quiet. It was most likely coming from one of the occupied, I thought myself, buildings in the area, carried by the wind. I checked each apartment as I went down the hallway. Minus one of them were empty and bare except for 3F. The door was shut. It was padlocked, not just closed. And a new one, gleaming silver on the corroded wood. For a long time, I stood there looking at it. This door was recently locked from the outside by someone. Then I ought to have gone. I knocked instead. I have no idea why. Perhaps to make sure nobody was inside. Or perhaps because I had a foolish curiosity about what was worth securing in a deserted building. There was stillness for a few seconds, so I turned the knob. Locked, of course. I kept going to the higher stories, but I kept feeling like someone was watching me. Do you recognize the tingling feeling at the nape of your neck? The corridors were still vacant, but I kept turning around in the hopes of seeing someone behind me. I discovered an unboarded-up window overlooking the neighborhood on the 6th story. I could see passing cars and people walking dogs from up there. Just a few hundred feet away, ordinary life is taking place. I felt somewhat better as a result. Something kept drawing me back to the building, even though I left and didn't give it any thought for the remainder of the week. On my way home from work, I passed it several times in my car. I began looking it up online. There were intentions to turn the building into condos after it was condemned 3 years ago due to a fire. But the project had stagnated. No information regarding security concerns or squatters, simply a waiting, deserted structure. I returned 2 weeks later. I convinced myself that it was to improve the images for a blog, was considering launching on urban exploring. Actually, though, I believe I was just checking to see if the padlock was still there. Yes, it was. However, the 3rd floor door was a little jarring this time. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood in that corridor for what seemed like an eternity. My chest, only about 3 inches of the door was open, allowing darkness to look inside. I was positive that I had seen it padlocked previously. I stayed in the corridor and either pushed the door open with my foot or someone had broke the lock. Unlike the others, the apartment was not deserted. It contained a small portable stove, plastic bags, a camping lantern, a sleeping bag stretched out on the floor, and furniture. This place was inhabited. Now the household odor I had previously detected made sense. But what really chilled me were the other things. Photographs littered the walls. Not graffiti or spray paint, but real photos. They taped and pinned hundreds of them on any surface they could find. From the doorway, I was unable to identify what they were. Consequently, I entered simply almost. They featured images of the neighborhood, the street outside, the building across the street, and ordinary people going about their daily lives, walking by, sitting at the bus stop, etc. It appeared as though each shot was taken from inside the structure, peering out through the cracks and the boarded windows. Dates were written in tidy little lettering on some of the pictures. They retraced months. With my skin crawling, I hurriedly backed out of the flat. This area belonged to someone, and whoever they were had been a long period of observing the street. I closed the door and made my way to the stairs. I heard footsteps below me at that moment. They came up from the second floor, slow and methodical. I listened and froze. Step 1, step 2, pause, and then another step. They weren't in a rush, whomever it was. I took a look around, in a panic. The only way down were the stairs, and I didn't want to bump into anyone going up them. In an attempt to slow my breathing, I ducked into the flat across from 3F and squeezed myself against the wall next to the door. When they got to the third story, the footsteps ceased. With my heart pounding in my ears, I waited. After a few seconds, I heard it. The noise produced when a key slides into a lock. The padlock. They were entering 3F, whoever it was. I didn't wait another second after hearing their door close. Taking them two at a time, I dashed for the stairs. Disregarding the noise I produced, I ran until I reached my car, after hitting the bottom floor and squeezing through the locked entryway. I had trembling hands as I drove home. The wheel, convincing myself that I had gone too far. What if someone was squatting in a building that had been abandoned? I have nothing to do with it. It's likely that they were unaware of my presence. However, I kept thinking about those pictures, the dates, and the meticulous recording of every person who went by. I choose to put it out of my mind. I didn't return, at least not on purpose. I was guiding my partner through the city last week, pointing out areas I had visited. She urged me to stop close to the same corner while we were going through Riverside District. She remarked, "That building is so cool," gesturing to it. "Very Gotham City. Have you ever taken a peek inside?" "It's just empty apartments," I said. "Could we have a look? I adore this thing." I didn't want to give an explanation, but I wanted to say no. The chain was still in place and still slack enough for us to get through when we approached the entryway. The lobby had the same appearance. I kept looking up the stairway, half expecting to hear those measured footsteps again, while she shot pictures as we ascended to the second floor. We made it to the third floor, and I passed 3F without pausing. However, my girlfriend saw the door. She stated, "This one's padlocked. What are they storing there, I wonder?" My stomach dropped. I pivoted, like it had always been there. The padlock was back on the door, gleaming and like new. "It's probably simply the tools of the building owner," I replied. "Come on, let's check out the upper floors." She followed me after shrugging. We explored for another 20 minutes, and during that time, I kept thinking that something wasn't right. I was glad to be back in the daylight when we eventually left. I had trouble sleeping that night. I couldn't stop thinking about the apartment, the pictures, and the chronology. If someone had spent months observing that street and recording every person who went past. I opened my laptop after getting up. I located the building using Google Maps. After that, I changed to Street View and browsed through the old photos from that era. I could just make out a figure standing in one of the third floor windows in an image taken 8 months ago. They seemed to be holding something up to the window, but the picture was blurry, perhaps a camera. As much as the image quality permitted, I zoomed in. Even though the person was only a shadowy silhouette, I could tell they were gazing straight at the Google Street View vehicle as it passed. I tried to convince myself it didn't matter and shut down my laptop. Here's what I can't stop thinking about, though. I wore a red jacket last week when I went to see my girlfriend. Bright crimson with a white stripe down the sleeve. It's rather unique. I don't frequently wear it. I drove by the building once more this morning. I have no idea why. I'm unable to articulate some compulsion. As usual, the building had the same appearance, dead, empty, boarded up. However, I noticed something that had never been there before in one of the spaces between the third floor plywood panels. A picture pressed up against the glass. On a Tuesday afternoon, while taking a shortcut home from work, I discovered the hospital. In an attempt to avoid a collision on the freeway, the GPS had sent me down a county road I had never been on before. I noticed it through the trees at that point, an enormous brick complex that is partially obscured by thick vegetation and situated back from the road. Brightwater Medical was written on a faded sign at the driveway center, but the structure behind it seems to have been abandoned for many years. I consider myself to be a photographer. While I work in insurance during the week, I spend the weekends exploring and documenting abandoned locations. Decomposition and what remains after people leave on have an honest quality. I therefore knew I would return when I saw Brightwater. I came back on Saturday with a backpack full of gear and my camera. I discovered a loading dock around back with a door that had been forced open. Despite the fact that the main entry was chained, the metal was bent outward, and where it had been forced, I could see new marks on the concrete. It had been visited recently. The air inside was stagnant and heavy. The beam from my flashlight pierced the night and revealed a hallway filled with supply closets and what appeared to be former offices. There were papers all over the floor, and I could see that the ceiling tiles had brown stains from water damage. A tiny coating of dust blanketed everything. I documented the main floor for the first hour, a calendar that was frozen in April 2019, and an ancient reception area with a desk still crowded with antiquated computer monitors were there. There were rows of plastic chairs in the waiting area. Some were overturned, while others were still neatly lined up, as though they were waiting for patients who would never arrive. I managed to capture some clear images of dust particles floating in the beams and light pouring through filthy windows. Most of the patient rooms were on the second floor. Even though they had lost everything of value, the shadows of who they had been were still visible. Mounting brackets in place of the TVS, dangling call buttons from walls. Occasionally, a clipboard gets stuck behind a radiator. They never came back for me. Was scribbled in marker on the wall of one room. It was probably dark humor, but it still unnerved me. Things began to seem strange on the third floor. I had gone through other stairway doors, but this one was different. This door was closed, but the others in the building were either falling off their hinges or had been left open. I discovered it had just been greased when I pushed it open. There was no sound from the hinges. The hallway on the third story was darker than the others. Most of the natural light was blocked by black plastic that someone had placed over the windows. In the quiet, my footsteps sounded too loud. I took my time, inspecting every room along the way. Like downstairs, most were deserted. However, I paused when I came to a chamber at the end of the hallway. The padlock on the door was a heavy-duty combination lock that appeared fresh new, not an old, rusted one. Trying to determine what to do, I stood there for a while with my hand on the door frame. Take action. Curiosity prevailed over my urge to turn around and go. The metal door had a tiny window at the top that was reinforced with wire mesh. I pointed my flashlight through while standing on my toes. The space had been prepared as a temporary examining room. In the middle was a gurney covered in crisp white linens. Adjacent to it, a metal cart had syringes, forceps, scissors, and medical equipment in orderly rows. I could see boxes lined up against the wall, piled high and marked with medical terms I didn't comprehend. Additionally, there was a little refrigerator in the corner that looked like it belonged in a laboratory. It had a digital temperature indicator that was softly lighting in the dark. The refrigerator was running. It hummed, and I could hear it. My mouth became parched. This was no longer merely urban exploration. This area was being used by someone, as well as lately. In my flashlight beam, the linens on that gurney appeared spotless, nearly white. The instruments were shining, I decided to call someone, so I stepped back from the door and took out my phone. However, what would I say? I discovered some medical equipment while trespassing in an abandoned building. It might be anything. Perhaps the site is being used by a film crew or someone storing supplies, or I was unable to come up with a plausible answer that didn't make me uncomfortable. Before I left, I made the decision to look over the rest of the floor. At the further end of the corridor were 2 more padlocked chambers. Neither one caught my eye. All I wanted to do was record them and leave. Then I noticed a light, though. It was emanating from beneath a door at about midway along the hallway. The floor was dark with a narrow yellow line. I had been concentrating on the padlocked rooms and hadn't noticed it before. I couldn't take my eyes off it now that I'd seen it. There was a person inside. A person who has electricity. I stood motionless, gasping for air. Now I could hear a faint, rhythmic, regular mechanical sound, like a ventilator or a pump. The sort of noise you may hear in a medical facility. However, this hospital had been shut down for 5 years. My entire logical brain begged me to go out. I had to know, though. I needed to know what I was seeing. I took care not to make any noise as I walked closer to the door. The sound of the machinery increased in volume. I tried to peek in by leaning in. When I heard another sound, it came through the breach. Voices. I could hear at least a person speaking in low tones, but they were muffled coming from within the room. Although I was unable to comprehend them, their tone was clinical and professional, like to doctors talking about a treatment. I nearly dropped my camera because my hands were trembling so much. I began to back off, heading toward the stairway as silently as I could. My foot struck something at that point. The box was made of cardboard and was leaning against the wall. It wasn't a loud impact, but it could have easily passed for a gunshot in that quiet hallway. A number of glass bottles rolled out over the floor when the crate toppled over. The voices abruptly stopped. I didn't hold up on opening the door. I took off running. My camera bag bounced against my back as I slammed into the stairwell at full speed and up the stairs 3 at a time. I didn't turn around when I heard footsteps in the corridor and a door open behind me. After arriving to the ground floor, I dashed through the hallways that I had just taken pictures of a few hours before and bounded out into the afternoon sunlight through the loading dock. I kept sprinting till I got to my car. I could hardly get the key in the ignition because my hands were shaking so much. I left while continuously glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to notice that I have a follower. However, the road behind me remained deserted. I made an effort to ignore it for the following week. There must be a plausible explanation, I persuaded myself. It might have been a movie crew. It might have been researchers doing a study. Perhaps it was medical students using mannequins for practice. But those explanations don't apply. Film crews don't, their sets are padlocked. Researchers don't operate in facilities that have been abandoned. And the refrigerator was running. In a condemned building, someone was paying to keep that electricity going. I was unable to let it go. I began investigating Brightwater Medical Center in an attempt to learn more about its history and the reasons behind its closure. The official narrative was straightforward. In 2019, the hospital closed after declaring bankruptcy. But when I looked more, I discovered something strange. The electricity had not been completely turned off in the building. Through a Freedom of Information request, I was able to obtain public utility data that showed the property still had an active account with monthly payments paid. Only enough electricity was used to run a few rooms. However, there was no doubt that someone was paying to maintain some parts open. An LLC was used to register the account. There was no information available. Nothing, no business registrations, no website, merely a utility bill name. I considered sharing this knowledge with someone. However, what would I say? I discovered some medical equipment after breaking into an abandoned hospital. I overheard conversations. None of it demonstrated that anything unlawful was taking place. And if I acknowledged I could be the one in trouble for trespassing, I thus took no action. I made an effort to move on. However, I had trouble sleeping last night. I couldn't stop picturing the room with the gurney, the spotless white linens, and the meticulously placed instruments. I kept hearing that steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. That mechanical sound. I launched my laptop and looked for the county's missing people. I spent hours reading about people who had disappeared without a trace, looking at faces and scrolling through reports, not knowing what I was hoping to find. There was nothing definitive that I could locate. Most of the reasons why people go missing have nothing to do with abandoned hospitals. However, I did observe an oddity. An abnormally high proportion of persons have vanished during the last 2 years after stating that they intended to seek out unaffordable medical care. Not many, perhaps a dozen cases, but sufficient to create a pattern if one was desired. According to the claims, they were in a terrible situation and discussed looking for other choices and unorthodox sources of assistance. According to one account, a woman told her sister she had discovered a location that would support her without asking any questions. 3 days later, she had vanished. Her vehicle was discovered abandoned approximately 15 miles from Brightwater on a county road. With my heart racing, I shut down my laptop and sat in the dark. Perhaps it was a fortuity. Perhaps the hospital had nothing to do with those individuals. Perhaps I was observing fictitious patterns, making connections between unrelated things. However, the image of that gurney, those crisp white sheets, and that refrigerator humming in the dark persisted in my mind. I passed Brightwater on my way to work this morning. I had no intention of doing so. It's located on a county road, which I happened to pass on my trip. I promised myself that I wouldn't quit because I was merely inquisitive. However, I noticed something that caused me to stop as I passed the entryway. Fresh tire tracks from the overnight rain were visible in the gravel driveway. It was likely within the last few hours that someone had driven in, and I could see a light on in one of the windows on the 3rd story, just barely visible through the trees. I spent a considerable amount of time sitting in my parked car, gazing at that light. I'm holding my phone. I ought to give someone a call. I ought to report what I had observed. However, what precisely should be reported? A window with a light. Tools in a secured space. I had overheard voices while trespassing. A van backed out of the driveway while I was sitting there pondering my options. It had tinted windows and was white and unmarked. For a brief period, I could see the driver peering in as it passed me slowly. My guidance. Then it disappeared as it went into the county road. I have no idea what else to do, so I'm writing this right now. I have not returned, and I have no intention of doing so. However, I occasionally consider the reports of missing persons late at night. I consider those who were so in need that they turned to question avoidance organizations for assistance, and I imagine that refrigerator, humming softly in the shadows, preserving something, keeping it cold, preserving something, keeping it cold. When I first entered Westfield Plaza, it had been vacant for 7 years. I had seen it progressively decay from a distance as I drove by it hundreds of times on the freeway. There were cracks and weeds growing in the huge parking lot. The names of the anchor stores were omitted, leaving the facade with spectral contours. It was a monument to the gradual demise of American retail, the kind of establishment that time forgot. I chose a Sunday in late October to investigate it. It was becoming cold outside, so I reasoned that if I was going to do something, I better do it now before winter made the building even worse. I don't know what I was hoping to discover. Perhaps some intriguing graffiti, some discarded goods, or the typical abandoned mall footage you see on YouTube. I had heard online that the old food court entry was open, but the main doors were blocked up with concrete blocks. I discovered it a broken set of badly boarded up glass doors around the side of the building. The plywood had been pulled loose by someone. I managed to go through. I was the first to notice the fragrance. Static water and mildew combined with an unidentified substance. The food court didn't work out. Tables were flipped. There is trash all about. The floor was covered in broken ceiling tiles. Water trickled steadily from above, forming shadowy pools on the linoleum. But there was no sound. Utterly silent. There are no noises of interstate traffic. Nothing. No birds. Only my footsteps reverberated in the deserted room. The size of the venue truly struck me when I entered the main concourse. The mall was a long hallway with gloomy storefronts that extended in both directions. Only a weak light could be seen through the dirty skylight above, gloomy light that gave the impression that everything was submerged. The flashlight on my phone seemed ineffective in the darkness. I began to look around the shops. The majority had been stripped bare. Dusty flooring and blank rectangles with no signage or fixtures. Some still carried traces of their past selves. I discovered one mannequin on its side and one arm in what was once a clothes store, extending a hand toward the blank screen. A few paperbacks were still strewn around in the corners of a bookstore, their pages distorted and bloated by the damp. I discovered the footprints at 45 minutes in. They were in a dusty area close to a former cell phone shop. Additionally, they were new enough that the edges were still distinct and sharp. Footprints going farther inside the shopping center. I got up. I tried to convince myself that they might have been from security or maintenance personnel as I stared at them, but I knew that wasn't correct. For years, this location had been deserted. Nobody was keeping it up. I ought to have gone back. I chose to follow them instead. The prints guided me toward the mall's north wing, past a frozen fountain that held stagnant brown water, and past a directory that was missing most of its letters. This compared to the main concourse. This portion was even darker. Nearly all of the natural light was blocked by the skylight, which had been entirely covered with something, perhaps a tarp or trash bags. What was once a department shop was transformed into the footprints. The entryway was a huge black rectangle, and I could only see a few steps inside with my flashlight. At the doorway, I paused and listened. Just that stifling silence. Nothing. I entered. The department store was enormous and utterly destroyed. There were areas of exposed concrete where even the floor tiles had been ripped out. I followed the footprints over the floor with my flashlight. They led to what I thought were staff quarters or storage rooms in the rear of the business. I finally saw the light at that point. It came from a doorway at the far end of the store and was only a faint glimmer, too dim to be used as a work light, more similar to a lantern or perhaps a camping light. Back there was someone. My heart began to race. I instantly switched off my flashlight and remained motionless in the dark, unsure of what to do. I didn't want to frighten the homeless if they were just camped there. However, there was something off about the arrangement. They had been intentional, purposeful footprints. This was no mere transitory visitor. I began to slowly back away in an attempt to get back where I had come from. I heard the voices at that point. I could hear the tone, but I couldn't make out the words coming from the bright doorway. There were several persons conversing, not in a loud or aggressive manner. Normal, almost unsettlingly normal for a deserted shopping center. Trying not to sprint, I made it back to the main concourse and hurried for the food court. My thoughts were racing. Who were those individuals? How come they were in there? Perhaps it was just people who had taken refuge in the deserted building, or a bunch of urban explorers like me. But I didn't like that light. It wasn't a passing phase. Everything looked as though someone had been there for a while, because everything was established and set up. I saw them as I was about to leave the food court. Additional footprints, many of them. On the way in, I hadn't noticed them, but now that I was searching for them, I found them everywhere, arriving and departing from service passageways, the corridors, and other stores. I was completely unaware of it. Some were fresh, while others were days old. Varying tread types and boot sizes. There were more than one or two campers. It was traffic, normal traffic. Without really rushing, I left that mall as quickly as possible. I sat for a while, my hands shaking, trying to take in what I had just witnessed when I got to my car. For the first time, I noticed something when I turned to face the structure. Numerous the boards were taken off of the windows on the second story that overlooked the parking lot. Very little openings in the plywood, perhaps a couple of inches across, but sufficient to allow someone to see outside, monitor the parking lot, and keep an eye on anyone who might be arriving. I spent the remainder of the day trying to persuade myself it was nothing as I drove home. In abandoned structures, people are always squatting. Homelessness is not a criminal offense. Perhaps it was a group of individuals who had fallen on bad times and sought refuge in a place that no one was interested in anymore. However, I was unable to halt pondering how well organized it appeared. The observation points on the second level, the numerous illuminated chambers, and the various footprints. I began my inquiry that evening. I looked up information about Westfield Plaza, including its closure and its history. The official narrative was straightforward: corporate bankruptcy, declining sales, and competition from internet shopping. In 2017, the mall has shut down. Its demolition had been discussed, but the property was involved in court cases involving creditors. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to account for what I had witnessed. Then, 3 years ago, I came across something in a local news forum. Someone asked whether anyone knew what was going on at the mall after seeing cars there late at night. Some replied that they had witnessed the same event. If you knew where to look, you could see the cars parked behind the building from the freeway. One individual reported witnessing individuals entering and exiting through a service entrance. Someone stated at the end of the discussion that they had called the police, but there was no news coverage, no investigative reports, nothing except that one exchange lost in a forum archive. I made an effort to let things go. Yes, I did. However, 2 weeks later, on my way home from work, I passed the mall once more, nearly 1000 p.m. It was late, and I didn't make plans to cease. I only wanted to make sure it was an empty building by seeing it. It wasn't empty, though. Inside, lights were on. There are only a few dim lights that may be seen from the second-story windows. Additionally, there were 3 cars in the parking lot that were partially obscured by a retention wall and out of sight from the freeway. In an attempt to obtain a better view without drawing attention to myself, I slowed down. There were 2 vans, one dark blue and one white. A sedan was the third. I couldn't see inside any of them because their windows were darkly tinted. One of the windows on the second floor moved as I was passing. I could see the blackness behind the board shift as it moved just a little. There was a person up there. There was a spectator. I continued. I checked my mirrors the entire way as I drove straight home. I probably shouldn't have done something the following day. I went to the library and looked for local missing people using their public computer. I don't know what I was hoping for, some sort of link, some explanation that would help me understand what I had witnessed. I discovered more than I anticipated. A consistent number of people in the county have been reported missing during the last 5 years. The majority were settled, those who had freely fled and been discovered with justifications. However, I was particularly interested in one subset, 8 individuals, ranging in age from teenagers to middle-aged adults, vanished without explanation. No bodies or signs of foul play were discovered. They simply vanished. 7 of them had vanished from areas within a 10-mile radius of Westfield Plaza, which was noteworthy. One had last saw less than a mile from the mall, at a gas station. My mouth was dry as I gazed at that knowledge for a long time. Perhaps that is a coincidence. Cases of missing persons tend to concentrate in densely populated areas, and there were people living here. The shopping centre was merely a marker. However, those lights, those cars, and those footprints guiding me farther into the shadows continued to occupy my thoughts. I haven't left. I don't intend to go back to the mall, but I do occasionally drive by it, usually in the middle of the night when I'm having trouble falling asleep, and I see the same sight nearly every time. There is movement behind the boards, automobiles in the parking lot, and lights in the windows. I observed something new last week. In order to provide simple access from the residential area behind the mall, a portion of the fence along the property line has been cut and bent back. After observing from a distance for some time, I noticed someone slipping through that opening. A young man with a backpack, perhaps 20 years old. He looked nowhere, didn't think twice. He approached the building if he had been there before and knew exactly where he was heading. I considered going with him. I considered phoning someone to report what I had observed. What would I report, though? An abandoned structure with lights in the windows and people entering. It doesn't prove anything. I thus take no action. Sometimes I just drive by and observe. and occasionally, just before the boards move back into position, I believe I see faces in those second-story windows when I'm stopped at the light beside the interstate exit. They're also observing, keeping an eye on the highways, the parking lots, and 4 others who are as inquisitive as I am. And I'm curious as to whether the young man with the rucksack ever returned. Does anyone monitor who enters? I wonder whether if I disappeared for a day, anyone would notice either. After the district constructed a new facility across town, Pine Ridge Elementary School closed in 2018. A co-worker who grew up in the region had told me about it. I was intrigued by the way he casually brought it up during lunch, describing how odd it was to see his former school lying empty. I had been searching for fresh places to take pictures, and an abandoned school looked ideal. It was nostalgic, a little depressing, and packed with the kind of details that get captured in time and create striking pictures. On a Saturday in early November, I went. The structure was encircled by forests on 3 sides and stood at the end of a dead-end street. Even though it was corroded and covered with vines, the playground apparatus was still present. Only the metal posts remained after someone had removed the school sign. The entire area exuded a sense of intentional desolation, as if the district had just shut off the lights and left. Although the main door was closed, I managed to find a window that was smashed in the rear. Carefully, the glass had been removed, and to make it easier to get through, someone had even set a milk carton underneath. I figured there had been previous urban explorers here. I entered a corridor that was lined with tiny lockers, the type intended for elementary school students. The scent of mildew and old paper filled the air. The tile floor reverberated with my footfall. Some backup system that hadn't completely died, yet continued to power the faintly glowing emergency exit signs. I checked a couple classrooms first, and they were just as I had anticipated. Whiteboards with ghostly streaks where writing had been clumsily wiped, desks pressed up against walls, and bulletin boards with faded decorations. One room still had an alphabet poster on the wall, with cartoon animals standing in for each letter. The S-snake, which was hanging at a strange angle, had partially peeled away. I was taking pictures of an abandoned globe in the 3rd classroom when I saw something strange. Unlike the other desks, one was not pressed up against the wall. It faced the whiteboard and was placed in the middle of the room as though it had been in use. A closed notebook with a pen resting across it was resting on top of the desk. I approached and cautiously opened the notepad. Handwriting in blue ink, crisp and careful, filled the pages. However, the writing was not that of a youngster. The content was odd, and it was an adult. The same sentence is repeated repeatedly on page after page. I'll pay attention. I'll get it. I'll be better. Perhaps 30 pages are filled with hundreds of repetitions. Toward the end, the handwriting became more shaky, as though the writer's hand had cramped from prolonged writing. I shut the journal and took a closer look around the room. I became aware of the whiteboard at that point. It had appeared blank from a distance. However, up close, I could make out faint writing that had just been wiped. Marker words that had been partially erased. I could see pieces. I need to comprehend the repercussions, and I won't do the same mistakes twice. My neck's back hair stood on end, in search of a name or date. I took up the notebook and turned it to the back. A single sentence was written in the same meticulous calligraphy on the very last page. The session ended on November 2nd. See you on Saturday of next week. It was November 4th today. Someone had been seated in this classroom 2 days prior, penning lines as if a pupil were being disciplined. I swiftly exited the room after setting down the notebook. The corridor felt different all of a sudden, waiting, but not empty. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Perhaps a strange art project or a treatment routine for an individual. Strange things are frequently done in abandoned structures. However, I discovered more as I explored further. 3 desks were set up in a row, facing the board, in another classroom. Like the original desk, each had a notebook on it. I didn't open. They had all been used recently, though, as I could tell. The covers were dust-free, and the pages were white and sharp instead of yellowed with age. Someone has arranged a circle of folding chairs in the gym, 7 of them, each facing inward and evenly spaced. A wooden stool stood in the middle of the circle, just that stool, as if it were a focal point, as if someone was supposed to sit there and be watched. I took pictures of everything, trembling a little. This wasn't a coincidence. This was planned. This school was being used for something by several people, gathering here on a regular basis, adhering to a schedule or framework. Then I ought to have gone. I wanted to check one more spot, though. The Office of Administration. If I could locate a sign-in form, or rather record of who, perhaps it would make sense if he came here. The office was located close to the main door in the front of the building. The door was unlocked, but it was closed. I shoved it open and entered. The space at the main desk was just as you would expect. Strewn papers, a dusty computer, and a coffee mug that was abandoned years ago. Just past the desk, however, was the slightly jarred door to the principal's office. Additionally, a light was emanating from within, not flickering, warm, electric, or candlelight. I went cold. My initial reaction was to flee. Something, nevertheless, held me there. Perhaps I could simply speak with someone, because they happened to be in that office at this moment in the middle of the day. Perhaps these would explain the situation. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The office had just been occupied, but it was deserted. Not long ago. Deserted. Not long ago. 3 still burning candles rested on the principal's former desk. There was a leather-bound book beside them, open to a page of names. I recognized the format right away. Although it wasn't from when the school was open, it was a sign-in sheet. This was novel. Every entry contained a name, a date, and a time, and the date spanned 6 months. Some names were mentioned only once, whereas others every week. Like clockwork, they kept coming up. I read the entries as I leaned in. Today was the most recent one, 3 hours ago. This morning at 9 a.m. under the name Candidate 7. Someone has written, "Our orientation begins." My blood froze. I took a closer look around the office. The top drawer of the filing cabinet in the corner was half open. I could see manila folders within, each with a number on it. According to what I could see, Candidates 1, 2, and at least 12. With trembling hands, I took out Candidate 7's folder. There were printed, not digital, photos within. They depicted a man, possibly in his 30s, sitting in a park, drinking coffee, and entering an office building in different parts of the city. He was by himself in each picture, and he appeared lost in each picture. There isn't a more appropriate term. His demeanor and posture gave the impression that he was unsure of their place. There was a textual document beneath the pictures. The words profile were displayed at the top, followed by lines of text that described the man's life, occupation, residence, daily schedule, and others with whom he had spoken, specifically, to whom he did not speak. A single statement emphasizing strong responsiveness marked the conclusion of the assessment. Go ahead and start phase 1. In the corridor, I heard footsteps. They were approaching slowly and methodically from the direction I had entered, just walking, moving closer, not trying to be quiet, but not hurrying either. After shoving the papers back into the cabinet, I desperately searched for another way out. The office had a separate door in the rear, which most likely led to a back entry or storage area. I gave the handle a try. Locked. Just outside the office, the footsteps ceased. I noticed a shadow moving over the frosted glass of the main door. There was a person waiting just across the street. Then I heard someone speak, masculine, serene, and quite amiable. "You're in there, I know that. It's all right. We're not angry." There were multiple individuals present. The voice went on, "You're merely early. That occasionally occurs. Before we locate them, people find their way here. In fact, it's a positive indication. Demonstrates initiative." I didn't answer. I pushed up against the adjacent wall, the filing cabinet, hidden from the doorway, attempting to regulate my respiration. "We saw you enter. Actually, we've been keeping an eye on you for a while to make sure you were appropriate, and you're a perfect fit." The door opened as the handle gently twisted. I can't recall ever deciding to move. I suddenly found myself reaching for the window that overlooked the parking lot behind the desk. It was ancient, the type that had an outward opening with a crank. Thankfully, it wasn't locked either. I turned it as quickly as I could and pushed through as soon as the opening was sufficiently large. Behind me, I heard someone walk into the office. I heard them say something, but I had already started to run toward the tree line across the parking lot. I didn't turn around. Branches scraped my arms and face as I crashed through the trees till I came to my street-parked automobile. As I drove home, I constantly checked my rearview mirror and drove 20 miles over the speed limit. 2 weeks have passed since then. I haven't returned. I've kept what I witnessed to myself. What would I say to them? That I broke into a shuttered school and discovered a filing cabinet and notebooks. That I was the target of a conversation. None of it establishes any illegality. However, I am unable to put those folders and those pictures of people who appeared lost out of your mind. Phase 1 of high receptivity, and what the voice said is still on my mind. We have been observing for some time. I saw a car parked across from my flat last week, a dark blue car with windows darkened. When I left for work in the morning and returned home in the evening, it was still there. Following 3, it vanished after a few days. I discovered something in my mailbox yesterday. One piece of paper, folded once, but not in an envelope. I discovered a picture when I opened it. It was a picture of me sitting in my car. The day I went to school, I was parked on that dead-end street, unaware that I was being photographed. I was staring down at my phone in the picture. Someone had scribbled in that on the back. I had noticed the same meticulous handwriting in the journal. We'll communicate shortly. You'll learn a great deal. So don't worry. I have begun to keep my curtains drawn. I've been traveling to work via several routes. I keep telling myself that nothing serious is going to happen, and that it's just someone attempting to frighten me. However, I discovered another picture hidden beneath my door this morning. This time, it was captured from within the building where I live. The corridor beyond my door, time-stamped when I slept the night before. See you next Saturday. Is the only sentence beneath the picture. When I made the decision to investigate, the Grandview Hotel had been down for nearly 10 years. It was a once elegant 4-story structure that served tourists when people still traveled by car and stayed in independent hotels. And it was located right off Highway 17. It was now ignored and forgotten. Simply another victim of the interstate system. The neon vacancy sign had been dead 4 years. The parking lot was deserted, and the windows were dark. As a freelance writer who is constantly seeking inspiration, I had been considering writing an article about an abandoned wayside motel. At least I told myself that the Grandview was ideal, secluded enough to keep me safe yet close enough to civilization to make me feel secure. On a Sunday afternoon, I parked close to the former wash facility and discovered an unsecured service entrance. The door squeaked open with ease, as if it had just been opened. I need to have focused more on that particular detail. Surprisingly, the interior remained undamaged. Scavengers usually demolish abandoned buildings, but the Grandview still had artwork on the walls, furnishings in the lobby, and even a dead plant in a pot close to the check-in desk. Everyone seems to have left in the middle of their shift. I took some pictures of the front desk area and the lobby. Room keys were still dangling on numbered hooks on the pegboard behind the desk. I tallied them. A few were absent, but the majority were present. Rooms 7, 15, 23, and 31 were most likely taken as mementos by earlier adventurers. The first floor corridor was lengthy and dark, with only the grey afternoon light coming in through the curtain gaps. I made some door attempts. When I turned the handle, room 12 opened, but the others were locked. It was a typical motel room. There is a TV fixed to the dresser, a little bathroom, and 2 double beds. The air smelled locked off and stale, and everything was covered in dust. I snapped a couple pictures and left. The 15th room was unique. I entered the room once the door had been unlocked and saw right away that it was cleaner than it should have been. Yes, there was dust, but not as much. There were sheets on the bed by the window. Relatively clean white bedding that appeared nearly new, rather than the old yellowed sheets you'd anticipate in an abandoned building. There was an unopened bottle of water on the nightstand. There was no sun damage or fading on the label. I took it in my hands and flipped it over. 6 months remained till the expiration date. Very lately, someone had been in this room. I looked in the restroom. I discovered a granola bar wrapper in the trash can, and a towel was dangling on the rack. The wrapper wasn't soiled or deteriorated. I took out my phone and looked at the date. This specific flavor was only introduced by the brand 3 months ago. My heart began to race. I investigated the other rooms with missing keys after leaving room 15. On the second floor was room 23, with comparable indications of recent habitation. It was likewise cleaner than it ought to have been. A cushion that appeared to be hardly used. On the bureau, a plastic shopping bag was nutsily folded. There was water in the bathroom toilet. The bowl hadn't dried out because someone had flushed it recently enough. The third floor room, number 31, was the one that bothered me the most. The room itself had a transitory, lived-in appearance. Although the bed was made, the pillow had dents in it, as if someone had slept on it. There was a notebook on the little desk beneath the window. I cautiously opened it. Lists of names and dates in various handwriting styles were contained within. A few entries were made in pencil, others in black, and some in blue ink, with entries every week or two. The dates spanned around a year. Each name has a number next to it. To 3574, I was unable to interpret the numbers. 5 days ago, the most recent entry was made. I was unable to read the name. It was shaky penmanship, and the top one. With shaky hands, I snapped pictures of the pages and shut the notebook. There was more to this than a squat in a deserted hotel. This was planned. On a schedule, several people come and go to document something. Somewhere underneath me, I heard a door close. It was a clear sound. The sound of a motel room door closing with a hard click. I listened and froze. Footsteps trailed down the corridor on the second floor, steady and leisurely. I walked over to the glass and gazed at the parking lot below. 2 cars that weren't there when I got there were now present. A dark pickup truck and a white van were parked close to the side entrance. The sound of footsteps ceased. Then, through the floor, I could hear muted voices. There are 2 or 3 persons conversing. The tone sounded businesslike, but I couldn't make out the words. Expert. Now I had to go. I cautiously opened the door to room 31 and looked around the corridor. Empty. Somewhere on the second story. I could still hear the sounds below. I made my way as silently as I could to the stairway. I noticed room 7 at that point. The door was slightly ajar. I hadn't yet looked in this room. The far end of the hall was where it was. Something prompted me to glance inside, even though I should have gone straight to the stairs. A figure was sitting on the bed, as I could see, despite the building's warmth. A man who might have been in his 50s was wearing a jacket, with his hands folded in his lap. He sat still, gazing at the wall opposite from him. He was not looking, reading, or moving. At a phone, just sitting there doing nothing. His head shifted toward me, toward the doorway, as if I had made a sound. For a brief while, our gazes locked, and I saw no surprise or fury in his face. Fear was the cause, fear, pure and desperate. Then he swiftly and intentionally averted his gaze and returned to stare at the wall as if I hadn't been there, as if he hadn't noticed me. With my heart pounding, I retreated from the door and made my way to the stairs. I walked quickly, 2 steps at a time, but I didn't run. One of the voices was much closer now, coming from around the corner of the second floor landing. It should arrive at any moment. I won't wait to hear the rest till we process him and move him to 23. I forced my way through the door of the stairway and continued down to the first floor. The service door that I had gone through was located at the building's far end. To get there, I had to cross the lobby. I looked at the pegboard with the keys as I walked by the front desk. The key to room 7 was now hanging there. It had never been there. I managed to get into my car and drove off, making myself not to drive too fast or attract too much attention. I observed a man emerge from the side entrance of the hotel and watch me leave in my rearview mirror. I could tell they were watching, but it was too far away to see well. I drove for 20 miles before I stopped. I spent the following week trying to interpret what I had witnessed. The trucks, the notepad with names and numbers, the rooms in use, and the man in room 7 who had appeared so terrified. I thought of sharing the information with someone. What would I tell them, though? That I had broken into a hotel that had been abandoned. I discovered a notebook with names in it, along with some persons. I began investigating local missing person instances in an effort to find trends. I couldn't show any connection to the motel, but I did find a few that seemed relevant people who had vanished in the previous year, all of them homeless or temporary, the kind of people who might not be missed straight immediately. Then, 2 years ago, I came across something in a local news piece. Shortly before it closed, the Grandview Hotel received a citation for code breaches. However, a hidden feature in the article was what drew my attention. I was unable to locate any information regarding the LLC that purchased the property from the previous owner. With no notification, no plans for renovations, and no development suggestions, the sale had taken place in private. The hotel had been purchased and was being kept exactly how it was abandoned and hidden from view. The man in room 7 began to haunt me in my dreams. That terrified expression in his eyes, his purposeful averting of his gaze, as if admitting my presence would place him in risk. I made a mistake last night. Around 2 in the morning, I drove by the hotel once more. I told myself that I would only gaze from the road out of curiosity. 3 of the windows in rooms 7, 15, and 23 had lights on. This time, there were 4 cars in the parking lot. The white van, the 2 cars I didn't recognize, and a pickup truck. One of the curtains in a first-floor window moved as I slowed down to take a closer look. Someone had been observing the route, keeping an eye out for any autos and anyone displaying excessive interest. I left, but this morning I discovered something that chilled me to the bone. My mailbox included a business card, just the card, without the envelope. There was only 1 line of text on a pure white background. The extended stay arrangements of the Grandview Hotel. A phone number appears beneath that, followed by the phone number in pen. We're getting ready for you in room 7. The check-in time is 8 p.m. on Friday. Avoid being late. I've spent hours looking at this card. I have no idea who left it. How they found me is a mystery to me. Furthermore, I have no idea what will happen if I fail to appear on Friday. However, I can't get that man sitting on the bed out of my mind, too scared to admit that I saw him. I can't get the names and numbers next to them out of my head. And I can't get the last entry out of my head, the number 1. The wobbly handwriting. 1 person, 1 day, or 1 opportunity. I'm afraid to find out what it implies, but I don't know. It's Friday in 3 days. On my nighttime runs, I became aware of the warehouse, a huge concrete structure with a faded Atlas Storage Solutions sign still visible on the side, was on the outskirts of the industrial sector. The building had remained vacant 4 years after the company's bankruptcy. That was my initial thought. Anyway, I'm a habitual person. Every evening after work, I run the same 5-mile route. Across the city, the road becomes less crowded and quieter at the 3 meters point, which is where the warehouse is located. I'd walked past it hundreds of times without really thinking about it. However, I observed something strange around a month ago. In the loading area behind the building, a car was parked 3 nights in a row. The same grey automobile was parked in the same position. It vanished the 4th night. A week later, 2 cars, a white compact and a black SUV, were parked in the loading area. By the time I hurried by the following day, both had left. It kept bugging me. It was intended that the structure would be abandoned. There were no construction permits, no for lease signs, and no indication that anyone should be there. But it was obvious that someone was there, and that they were frequently visiting. When I had more time on a Saturday morning, I made the decision to investigate. I convinced myself that it was simply out of curiosity, that I would glance about and find something to pique my interest. The pre-renovation assessments may have been performed by contractors, a film team, or even urban explorers like the ones I had seen on YouTube. The loading dock had a bay door that had been partially forced open, but the main entrance was padlocked and guarded with a hefty chain. Crouching down and slipping underneath was possible with just enough room. The concrete featured new scuff marks that indicated this entrance had been used frequently. There was a void inside the warehouse, with support columns spaced every 20 feet. The main floor was largely unoccupied. Dusty light puddles formed on the concrete floor as sunlight streamed through dirty skylights high overhead. It was still and cool. My footsteps reverberated off the walls as I moved more into the room. Old offices with windows overlooking the warehouse floor were scattered around the perimeter. A handful still had filing cabinets or desks, but the majority had been scrubbed bare. I discovered the first camera in one of these offices. It was a little, polished-looking device that aimed toward the warehouse floor and was fixed in a ceiling corner. It had a tiny red glowing LED light on it. Recording in progress. My stomach dropped. This building wasn't deserted. This place was under surveillance. Additionally, it appeared to be a high-end camera that could be used for more than merely deterring vandals. I scanned the warehouse floor from this new angle as I peered out the office window. At that point, I saw tire tracks and imprints on the concrete, which led to a big freight elevator at the rear of the structure. One of those industrial models, made to transport large machinery from one floor to another, was the elevator shaft. The elevator's call button was lighted. The electricity was on. I was too far in, even though my gut screamed me to get out. After pressing the button, I heard equipment underneath operate for a brief moment. The elevator was approaching. The elevator car was empty when the doors opened. The control panel had buttons for 3 basement levels, and the inner walls were marked with recent scuffs. This had been used frequently by someone to move objects up and down. I entered and hit the button for the first basement level, B1. With a mechanical hum, the elevator lowered itself and the doors closed. There were separate storage facilities on the first basement level, the type that individuals rent to store boxes or furniture. These units, however, were distinct. Each featured a sturdy industrial door that was locked with a numeric keypad. Additionally, there was a tiny plaque with the numbers and letters 1, 2, and 3 above each door. I walked slowly and listened as I continued down the corridor. A slight humming sound that sounded like climate control or ventilation reached my ears. These units had climate control. The value of whatever was being kept here warranted temperature control. The door of Unit A7 was ajar just a little. I ought to have left, ought to have returned immediately to the elevator and departed. But I was already present, and the door stood open. The apartment was roughly 10 by 10 feet, with metal shelves running the length of the walls. Plastic bins that were similar and labeled with dates and reference numbers were stacked on the shelves. I opened one after pulling it down. Personal belongings were inside, like evidence in a police investigation. A wallet, a watch, a phone, keys, and some jewelry are all neatly arranged in separate plastic bags. However, this was not a police station. I looked at the bin's label. It carried the reference number J447 and the date from 4 months ago. I went to a different shelf and opened another bin. The same thing. All personal items are labeled and packaged. Different date, different reference number. 6 months have passed since this one. This one unit alone included dozens of bins. Additionally, this had at least 20 units. The floor. As I replaced the bin on the shelf, my hands were trembling. I retreated from the apartment and peered down the hallway. How many of these units had the same contents? How many people's possessions were kept here? I heard the elevator start up. There was a descendant. I hurriedly searched for another way out. I noticed a door marked stairs at the far end of the hallway. I sprinted as stealthily as I could. I arrived right as I heard the elevator doors behind me open. The stairs had metal rails, concrete walls, and a dark, industrial appearance. I was afraid to use the flashlight on my phone. I felt my way up, going as fast as I could without making any noise. Above I heard a door open behind me. Someone had come from one of the higher floors into the stairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps boomed down toward me. I pressed myself up against the wall and stopped, and the footsteps ceased. Then a voice echoed throughout the stairway, calling out. He was quiet, male, and had an accent I couldn't identify. You ought to recognize you. If you cooperate, it will be simpler. I didn't answer, remained motionless. Every floor has a camera. We are aware of you're alone. We are aware of what you witnessed. Come out so we can have a civil conversation about this. Once more, the footsteps began to descend, nearer. I glanced at the adjacent door. B2, the second basement level, was the destination. I pushed past it as silently as I could and entered another storage unit corridor. Only emergency lighting provided a faint illumination on this darker level. These units, however, were distinct. Rather than keypads, they included ventilation grates close to the floor and strengthened locks. I could hear noises coming from some of the flats as I passed them. Little noises, motion, and what could have been breathing. I came to a halt in front of B12. I had a glimpse of the interior through the ventilation grate. Inside, there was a cot, and a shape on the cot. Someone curled up on their back, motionless. I muttered, "Hello," through the grates. I heard a voice after a moment, but the form remained motionless. The quiet horse quit. Don't attempt to assist. They will simply put you in one as well. I heard the door to the stairway open behind me before I could reply. I took off running. On the other side, I discovered another stairwell. I climbed past B1 and the ground floor, reaching the second story and place I was unaware existed after reaching the end of the passageway. I entered what appeared to be residential quarters after pushing through the entrance. Numerous rooms were furnished with lockers and bunk beds, much like dorms. A few of the beds appeared to have been used recently. Daylight came in from a window at the far end. It was unlocked as I sprinted for it, and I climbed out onto a fire escape. I fell the final few feet to the ground as quickly as I could. I didn't stop until I was inside my apartment. The door latched, and I raced all the way home. 3 weeks have passed since then. I haven't returned. I've kept it a secret. How would I respond? That when I broke into a warehouse, I discovered storage containers filled with personal items. Through a vent, I heard a voice. I've been investigating missing person instances and looking for trends, but I'm not sure what I actually saw. It's more than I anticipated. Many of the individuals who vanished in recent years were temporary or unrecorded. Individuals who would not be missed right away. I've also been keeping an eye on the warehouse from afar. Even yet, the cars still typically arrive in the evening. Occasionally, only one, and occasionally, more. After parking in the loading area, they depart after spending varied lengths of time there. I saw something last week that stopped me cold. 2 individuals got out of a van as it approached the loading dock. They assisted someone by opening the rear of the van. Someone walking shakily, as if under the influence of a drug or ill. They led this individual inside and to the loading dock entrance. 10 minutes later, the van was empty. I called a tip line, reported it anonymously, and described what I had witnessed. I stated the unusual behavior, supplied the address, and gave a description of the structure. Nothing took place. There wasn't any investigation visible to me. The automobiles continued to arrive. The building was busy at night and was silent throughout the day. Either someone made my tip vanish, it was disregarded. Something I saw yesterday chilled me to the bone. A simple white business card with simply a phone number and one typed line was tucked into my door frame when I returned home from work. Storage Solutions by Atlas. We protect what is important. The reference number J512 was inscribed in pen on the back. I checked that storage unit for the last reference number I had seen, J447. If they are sequential, then that was 4 months ago. If each one has been rising in turn, I went ahead and counted. About now would be J512. Roughly this week, since I discovered that card, I haven't left my residence. From my window, I'd been scanning the street for white vans, grey sedans, or anyone seated in a parked automobile. I noticed the identical black SUV that I had seen at the warehouse this morning. I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat of the car that was parked across the street. They had been waiting and observing for the past 6 hours. 6 hours after a state audit determined that maintaining Riverside Correctional Facility was no longer cost-effective. It closed in 2016. While looking for places for a documentary project I was working on, I came upon an article about it in a local history blog. Previously a minimum security prison, the facility primarily housed non-violent prisoners participating in work release programs. The authorities had only moved the last prisoners and secured the doors when it closed. While many state agencies discussed what to do with the land, it sat in bureaucratic limbo. On a Thursday afternoon in late September, I took a car out there. The facility was only reachable by a single two-lane road, surrounded by farmland, and located around 40 minutes outside the city. The property was enclosed by a barbed wire and chain-link fence. However, I discovered a spot where the fence had been ripped aside by someone who had cut through it. I managed to go through. The main building was a 2-story, long, rectangular construction with small, barred windows on both floors. Concrete was laid. The architecture was brutally practical, and steel, not for comfort, but for containment. I thought the tiny building behind the main building was the administrative office. First, I attempted the main entrance. A strong padlock held it in place, but the window next to it had been shattered, most likely by earlier adventurers. I climbed through after removing the last of the glass. The inside was just how one could anticipate from a closed prison. Long hallways with metal day rooms and cells on either side. There was a cafeteria with an empty serving line and tables fastened to the floor. The bones of the place were still there, but everything that was precious was taken away. The walls had been painted that certain institutional green that seemed to be used in all government buildings. I began by recording the communal areas and cells on the first floor. Small concrete rooms with metal bed frames and toilets were visible through the majority of the cell doors that were left open. Some had previous occupants' graffiti on them, dates, initials, and sloppy illustrations. 247 days were etched into the wall of one cell. Years ago, the countdown had come to an end. Something odd caught my attention on the second floor. The door of cell to 217 was closed and secured with a new padlock that was inserted through the handle other than the conventional cell lock. The cell wasn't empty, as I could see through the tiny glass in the door. Inside was a folding chair, facing the wall in the middle of the space. A camera was set on a tripod on the wall and aimed at the chair. There was a tiny red light on the camera. It was being recorded. For a long time, I stood there attempting to interpret what I was seeing. Why would someone install a camera in a jail cell that has been abandoned? What were they filming? I checked other cells as I went down the hallway. 3 more were set up similarly, with chairs facing cameras and fresh padlocks. In one, the chair was surrounded by studio lights. A microphone on a stand was visible in another. This wasn't a coincidence. This was professional and purposeful. These cells were being used for filmmaking, places, and the equipment was being regularly maintained. Downstairs, I heard a door close and then heard conversations. Having hurried to the stairway, I listened. 2 or 3 people conversing in everyday conversational tones. They were approaching the stairs as they made their way through the first floor. By 6, it should be ready. As usual, we'll bring him in through the east entrance. Did he accept the conditions? He doesn't have a lot of options. The same as the others. They always cooperate after we show him the paperwork. The stairs was approaching the sounds. I frantically searched for another exit. I noticed a maintenance door at the end of the hallway. I heard footsteps on the stairs, so I sprinted as stealthily as I could and snuck inside. The tiny, dim maintenance area was crammed with outdated cleaning supplies and malfunctioning machinery. A tiny window, too small to climb through, was located high on the wall. I waited while leaning against the wall near the door. The footsteps came to a halt when they reached the second story. I heard footsteps reverberating on the concrete as someone moved down the hallway. They paused in front of a cell. I heard a padlock being opened and keys jingling. Positioned in 217. That's where we'll conduct the interview. 30 minutes in standard format. The release form. What about it? After that, we'll have it autographed. Once they comprehend the problem, they become more cooperative. The cell door opened and closed, and then footsteps heading toward me as they returned down the hallway. I heard them go down the stairs when they passed the maintenance room without pausing. I hardly breathed for 5 minutes before I took the chance of opening the door. The hallway was deserted. As I passed cell 217, I glanced through the window before making my hasty way to the stairs. The lights inside had been switched on by someone. The camera was set up and prepared. The chair in the middle of the space, but suddenly I noticed something I had previously overlooked. There were shackles on the floor next to the chair. The chair legs have leather straps fastened to them. I didn't hold off on seeing more. I descended the stairs and made my way to the broken window that had let me in. I heard sounds coming from the administration building once more as I climbed out. There are at least 4 persons, if not more, gathered outside the entryway. I sprinted. I expected someone to yell after me as I crossed the wide space between the buildings and the fence, but nobody did. Without seeing anyone, I managed to get back to my car through the opening in the fence. For a while, I sat in my car and tried to lower my heart rate. I could make out the administration building through the woods. Behind it, out of sight, were 2 cars parked, a dark automobile and a white cargo van. Another vehicle arrived and parked beside them as I was watching. I turned on my car and drove off, continually looking in my mirrors. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd witnessed for the next few days. Bringing him in, the chairs, the cameras, the restraints, and the discussion about persuading people to cooperate when they viewed the documentation. I attempted to conduct internet research to find out if there was any information regarding filming at the former prison, licenses, or permitted uses. Nothing. Public documents indicated that the structure remained protected and closed while the state made its decision. I investigated recent situations involving missing persons, but I couldn't identify any apparent trends, or at least nothing that was directly related to the institution. I then began to consider what they had said. The same as the others, they always cooperate after we show him the paperwork. In an abandoned prison, what kind of documentation compels someone to assist with being filmed? Why would someone consent to being recorded when confined in a chair? I considered those who may be blackmailed or pressured, those who had secrets, and those who had made blunders. I made a choice last week that I regret. I returned. I told myself that without evidence of what was occurring, I couldn't approach anyone, and that I needed additional information. In reality, though, I believe I only needed to comprehend. This time I went at night, parked farther away, and walked up. There was still a gap in the barrier. I managed to get through and made cautiously making my way through the dark to the main building. They boarded up the smashed window. I discovered a service door in the back that was left unsecured, but someone had secured it since my last visit. I entered. It was completely dark inside the structure. I kept the flashlight on my phone aimed toward the floor. I walked to the corridor with the cells on the 2nd floor. Each of the 4 camera-equipped cells was currently occupied. I could see individuals seated in the chairs through the tiny windows in the doors. 4 distinct individuals, each seated motionless and facing the cameras in their own cells. They had the red recording lights on. I walked over to cell 217 and had a closer look through the window. A middle-aged man dressed in business casual was inside. He had his hands clasped, the chair's armrests, although he was not in a harness. His face was expressionless as he sat there looking into the camera. I could see a younger woman, perhaps in her 20s, in the cell next to it. The same scene, the same expressionless face, just sitting there while being filmed. I slowly retreated. This was incorrect. This was all wrong. These folks required assistance. However, I was unsure of what I could accomplish. What would I say to the police if I called them? Are they going to believe me at all? I heard footsteps on the stairs as I turned to go. Many people going swiftly. The door to the maintenance room was locked as I dashed for it again. I tried the supply closet next door, but it was locked as well, except for the cells that contained humans. All of the corridor's doors were locked. The second story was reached by the footsteps. I heard voices. The motion sensor was activated by someone. Examine each room. Sensor for motion. I had no idea they had security. There was just one thing I could do. I tried using cell 2 to 9's handle. One of the filming chambers was vacant. It had been unlocked. Slipping inside, I pushed the door nearly shut, allowing only a little gap for light to pass through. I could hear them going down the hallway, looking in cells and checking doors. They came to a halt outside cell to 217. The subject complies. There are 20 minutes left in the session. Problems? Not at all. Since we began, he has remained motionless. They went on down the hallway. As they went by my cell, I held my breath. When one of them tried the handle, and it didn't open completely, they assumed it was locked like the others and moved on. They headed back downstairs after what seemed like a lifetime. I slipped out after waiting for 10 more minutes. I managed to exit and return to the barrier. I glanced back at the structure again. I squeezed through the opening. I could see the dim glimmer of light from the filming cells in a few of the windows on the second story, and I noticed a silhouette, someone standing there keeping an eye on the grounds in one of the first floor windows. They had been aware of my presence the entire time. They would let me go. I have not returned since. 6 days have passed since then. However, I got an email this morning from an unfamiliar address. No subject line. All I saw when I opened it was a link to a video file. Even though I shouldn't have, I clicked. Cell to 217 was seen in the video. The chair facing the camera was occupied by the middle-aged man I had seen. This time, however, he was speaking and making a confession. The audio was not audible to me. It was a muted video, but I could see the tears streaming down his cheeks and the movement of his lips. The video then shifted to a new viewpoint. Same dude, same cell. Now, however, I could see myself through the window of the cell door. In the backdrop, I was peering in, the brightness on my phone illuminating the shadows. The video clearly and unmistakably zoomed in on my face. There was only one line of text at the bottom of the email. Your session has been set up in cell 223. Details about the schedule will be communicated shortly. I've been looking at the windows all the time. I've been taking different routes to work. I haven't discussed this with anyone since I'm not sure how to explain it without coming out as crazy or worried. My phone buzzed this afternoon with a text message from an unidentified number. Your paperwork has been put together. We believe you'll find it thorough. At 8 p.m. on Friday. Don't let us come look for you. There was an attachment beneath the text. I have yet to open it. I'm worried about what it could reveal, what they might have about me, and what errors they've made. Recorded. The moments they caught that I believe to be personal. Tomorrow night is Friday, and I'm still not sure if I'll go. When I initially hopped the fence, Lakewood Amusement Park had been deserted for 12 years. Following a string of safety infractions and dwindling attendance, the park closed. On 40 acres near the county's boundary, it was gradually being reclaimed by the natural world. From the highway, the tracks of the roller coaster could be seen, decaying like a skeleton against the sky. I'd been hired as a graphic designer to make some artwork for a client's vintage gaming project. Lakewood was about an hour away from my place, and they wanted real abandoned amusement park pictures for reference. I assumed that I would finish taking photos by lunchtime after spending a couple hours on the task. Climbing the barrier was simple. There were holes close to the former parking lot where the chain link had sagged over time. On a Saturday morning in early October, I managed to get through. There were cracks in the parking lot and overgrown, with tiny trees poking through the paved surface. Broken hinges held the main entrance gate open, causing it to hang at an angle. Past it, I could make out the main avenue of the park, which used to be dotted with food and gaming booths. The majority of the buildings were either highly graffiti tagged or in the process of falling. Welcome to Lakewood, a worn sign, hung on one chain. I began recording everything. the rotating wheel with its missing horses and flaking paint. Debris and standing water swamped the bumper car arena. The prizes from the Midway Games were long since looted. Everything had the appearance of frozen decay, as if the park had ceased operations in the middle and had just withered away. I saw something strange next to the funhouse after an hour or so. The two-story building, painted in faded psychedelic colors, was still largely intact. The entrance, however, was not sealed or boarded up like the rest of the park. The door appeared to open if I tried it, but it was closed. I approached the door and yanked the handle. The hinges were silent as it opened easily. They had just been greased by someone. The funhouse's interior was dim, but not entirely dark. It was dimly lit from somewhere farther inside the structure. I navigated the entrance passage, which led to a hall of mirrors, using the flashlight on my phone. The way through the darkness was confusing because the majority of the mirrors were broken or missing. I began to see elements that didn't fit as I dug further. Although not immaculate, the floor was far cleaner than it ought to be. There was no debris or leaves blown in from the outside after 12 years of abandonment. This area had been kept up by someone. The hallway led to a larger space that had previously been occupied by tilted floors and whirling tunnels. With the exception of the light I had seen from outside, it was now largely deserted. 3 camping lanterns were set up in a triangle in the middle of the space. They were operational and ran on contemporary batteries. Someone had set up 5 folding chairs in a circle, facing inward, around the lanterns. A sheet of paper that was weighted down with a rock was placed on each chair. I picked up one of the papers as I cautiously approached. It was a printed picture, an image of a woman in her 30s caught in the middle of a car crash or a metropolitan street, unaware that she was being photographed. She was staring down at her phone. Someone has written subject 3, day 14 inches in marker, at the bottom of the picture. I looked at the other chairs. They all had the same picture. Various persons, various settings, all unscripted photos in which the subjects were unaware that they were being taken. Each one has a number and day count labeled on it. On day 47, subject 5 was present. I heard voices outside the funhouse as I started to back away from the chairs. They were approaching, though they were far away, coming from somewhere in the park. Several people conversing informally. I hurriedly switched off the flashlight on my phone and stepped to the room's edge, where I pressed myself against the wall in the darkness. The voices increased in volume. I could now clearly hear them. At least 3 individuals, having a professional conversation about anything. Verified. She stays on the same path. Home, workplace, gym, or coffee shop. She adds the library on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Is there a pattern deviation? Not at all. She is reliable. She is therefore perfect for phase 2. When are we going to get there? We'll get in touch at the coffee shop next week. Informal and amiable. The fun house was directly in front of them. I could now make out beams of flashlights heading toward the main room through the corridor of mirrors. I hurriedly searched for another way out. I noticed a door marked employees only on the far side of the room. I approached it as stealthily as reached it as soon as the voices came into the main room. After sneaking past the door, I entered a small service hallway. It was pitch dark. I moved away from the sounds and felt my way along the wall. I could hear them talking about something behind me, but I was no longer able to understand what they were saying. I noticed an emergency exit and a glimmer of daylight as the passageway curved. I persevered and discovered I was facing the park's former employee area from the rear of the fun house. I didn't pause to survey my surroundings. I sprinted in the direction of the fence, scaled it, and didn't slow down until I was back in my vehicle. I could hardly get the key in the ignition because my hands were shaking so much. 3 weeks have passed since then. I made an effort to ignore it. I convinced myself that it was simply an odd group project or an art installation by urban explorers. Anything could have been the purpose of the pictures, a photography project, a documentary, or perhaps just casual viewers. However, I kept thinking about the labels. Day 14, Subject 3. As if they were tracking individuals, recording their whereabouts, and recording the talk I had heard. She is reliable. She is therefore perfect for phase 2. What is phase 2 of? I got to work on my research. I investigated cases of missing persons, looking for any link to the park or the neighborhood. I saw something odd, but I couldn't locate anything definitive. Numerous accounts of persons experiencing what they called persistent following have surfaced within the last 2 years. The feeling that someone was following them about, showing up where they often went. Although the victim had reported it to the police in each instance, the stalker was never found. When I plotted the locations of these reports, I found that they were concentrated around Lakewood, not directly adjacent to the park, but within a 20-meter radius. Eventually, the cases were closed as unfounded. 5 subjects, 5 cases. I made a mistake last week. During the evening, I drove by the park to check on anyone. 4 cars were parked in the former parking lot. I could see lights coming from various sources, such as lanterns or flashlights, going through the park close to the entrance, as if they were part of a planned event. I noticed someone standing close to the fence, so I slowed down to have a better look. They were pointing toward the road, and as my car went by, they held up their hand as if to communicate to someone without actually waving. I noticed one of the parked automobiles switch on its headlights in my rearview mirror. In an attempt to lose them, I accelerated and took the next corner. Before I was certain that no one was following me anymore, I drove for 20 minutes, taking erratic turns. I looked for tracking devices in my car when I arrived home. I'm not sure what to look for, but I didn't find anything. Something showed up on my porch 2 days later. An envelope made of manila, just my name, carefully handwritten on the front, with no return address or postage. A printed photo, similar to the ones I had seen in the amusement house, was inside. From a distance, it was me making my way to my car. It was my office parking lot, and I knew where it was. It was a recent photograph, most likely shot in the past week. It was scrawled at the bottom in the same marker that I had previously noticed. Day 1 of subject 6. Since then, I've been keeping an eye out for them, changing up my routine, and searching for the same faces at various locations. I thought I knew the person I saw yesterday. A man reading a newspaper while seated in a coffee shop I had visited. That's nothing out of the ordinary, but I had seen the identical man in the grocery store 3 days prior, and at the petrol station close to my apartment 5 days prior. He never gives me a straight glance or makes it apparent, but he's constantly there, lurking around me. I discovered another photo this morning. This was placed beneath my windshield wiper when my vehicle was parked at the fitness center. It showed me walking out of my apartment complex. It appeared to have been taken from inside a parked automobile across the street based on the angle. Day 19, 19 days, subject 6. It wasn't until a week ago that I realized they had been observing me for 19 days. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? In public spaces, I am being photographed. It's not against the law. I don't have any evidence that something is truly dangerous, just pictures and the increasing sense that, like everyone else, I'm being watched, researched, and tracked. What I overheard in the funhouse is still on my mind. The second phase. What transpired after they completed recording a person's daily schedule? What happened next? I've been investigating those who claim to have been followed in an effort to learn more about their post-case outcomes. 3 of them have completely vanished from their internet presence, gone silent, or erased their social media accounts. 1 abruptly relocated out of state. There is no forwarding address. I am unable to locate any information regarding the 5th one. They seem to have disappeared. I got a text message from an unidentified number tonight. We've found your pattern. It's nice that you're highly predictable. It facilitates the following stage. Someone will get in touch shortly. We advise you to collaborate. The transitions for the others who resisted were far more challenging. There was an attachment, a picture, beneath the text. I have yet to open it. With all the lights on and the curtains drawn, I'm sitting in my apartment attempting to make a decision. I'm tempted to open the picture to see what they've captured. I'm a little afraid of what it might reveal. Just now, my phone buzzed once more. The same number texted me again. Phase 2 will start at your usual coffee shop tomorrow at 8 a.m. in conversation. The person who comes up to you will utilize the word consistent. You will be aware of what to do. Tomorrow. I'm not going to that coffee shop. However, I must go somewhere. I have to keep up some sort of schedule. Go to work and go about my business, and they'll be observing, making notes, keeping track of the days, and waiting for me to make a mistake and return to normal. Day 20 of Subject 6. Day 20 of Subject 6. When the city reopened the subway line in 2009, the former Fairmont station was closed. 4 months, I had been enthralled by videos of urban exploration, seeing people traverse deserted tunnels and derelict infrastructure. I knew I had to visit Fairmont as soon as I heard about it. Accessible via maintenance tunnels that purportedly linked to the operational subway system. The station was located beneath what is today a commercial district. On a Sunday night, shortly after midnight, when there was little foot activity, I located the entrance. There was in Chinatown. A service door behind a Vietnamese eatery is identified by faded signs from the Metropolitan Transit Authority. Someone had used a brick to hold the door open years ago after the lock broke. 3 flights of stairs led down into the blackness. The light from my flashlight hardly made it through the darkness in front of me. With every step, the air became damper and colder, bringing that characteristic underground odor of stagnant water and concrete. I ended up in a maintenance corridor with electrical conduits and pipes at the bottom. Decades of filth had accumulated on the walls. I went about 50 feet down the corridor before it led to the former station platform. The size of Fairmont Station exceeded my expectations. With elaborate tile work dating back to the 1920s, the platform extended at least 100 feet in each directions. You could still see the ornamental designs, even though the majority of the tiles were broken or missing. Below, the tracks vanished into tunnels at either end and were deserted. I took pictures of the platform for 20 minutes, the antique turnstiles and the old posters from advertisements that are still hanging on the walls. In an abandoned subway station, everything was just as it should be, forsaken, dilapidated, and stuck in time. Then I became aware of the tracks. Near the tunnel entrance, they were in an area of dust, so fresh that the edges were still sharp. Footprints. Heading into the southbound tunnel, there are at least 3 distinct tread patterns. I looked at my most recent photos timestamp. I had spent 23 minutes in the station. When I got here, these prints weren't there. I held my flashlight out into the tunnel. I stood at the edge of the platform. Before the darkness engulfed it, the beam may have reached 30 feet. I paid close attention. I could hear water dropping and the background noise of the subway system that ran parallel to this abandoned line in the distance. And another item. From far down the tunnel came a soft, constant, repetitive mechanical sound. Although I should have left, I persuaded myself that it was most likely just maintenance personnel inspecting the outdated infrastructure, because I was already here. I descended onto the railroad tracks and began to enter the tunnel. The further I went, the louder the mechanical sound. It reminded me of the steady operation of a pump or generator. The tunnel curved after approximately 200 feet, and I could see light up ahead. It has a faint glow, similar to that of work lights that run on batteries. I moved more carefully and slowed down. The tunnel led to what appeared to be a junction where several railroads met. A workspace had been established here, complete with folding tables, equipment cases, and a number of those LED work lights for illumination. However, this was not a maintenance task. Electronics, computer hardware, routers, and hard drives were arranged in rows on the tables. The equipment was connected by cables to what appeared to be a backup generator that was buzzing in the corner. Everything was well planned, expertly done, and obviously a part of a continuous process. I saw a number of large plastic bins, the kind you use for moving near the tables. Dates and alphanumeric numbers were used to identify them. I cautiously opened one. Dozens of passports wrapped in elastic bands were inside. I took one out and opened it up. The young man in the picture was around 25, with a birth date that would have made him precisely 18. The listed name, John Smith, was plainly a fraud. I looked at others, and they were all comparable and had all been released recently, likely within the past year. I checked another bin and replaced the passport. This one included credit cards with matching IDs that were still in their activation sleeves. There are hundreds of them. Now my heart was racing. This was a severe matter. This was no longer urban exploration. I had discovered something systematic and unlawful, perhaps worse than identity theft or document falsification. When I heard voices reverberating down the tunnel, I began to move away from the tables. From the direction I had entered from Fairmont Station, they were approaching. There were several people talking, their voices echoing in the darkness. I glanced around wildly. There were 3 tunnels branching at the intersection. One led to Fairmont again. There was one that seemed to link to the running subway line. In the distance, I could hear trains. The third, which might have been a service tunnel, was smaller. I picked the service tunnel and slipped into it as silently as possible. About 30 feet in, I discovered an alcove that was most likely utilized for equipment storage. I shut off my flashlight and pushed myself into it. The voices came to the intersection. Now I could hear them well. The shipment is prepared for Friday. 200 units with a variety of qualifications. It is verified that the route passes via Newark. What about last week's surveillance concern? A false alarm. A transit police officer conducting standard inspections. He failed to locate the access point. In any case, we ought to move. We've spent 4 months here. Too long in one place. I heard equipment shifting and movement. They were working on something, perhaps the bins or the electronics. I was afraid to look. One of the speakers then made a statement that made I feel chilled. Was there anyone else present tonight? I believed I had spotted new tracks on the platform. There was silence, followed by footsteps returning to Fairmont Station. Examine the access point. Verify that it is safe. I was unable to remain in Old Cove. They would discover my entry path. If they were looking at the access point, they would begin hunting the learning that someone had descended. In total darkness, I felt my way along the wall as I made my way farther into the service tunnel. I could hear them coordinating a search by yelling out to one another behind me. Beams of light raced across the intersection and bounced off the curved tunnel walls. The service tunnel has a small upward slope. I sensed fresh air flowing from above after approximately 100 feet. When I peered up, I noticed what appeared to be a manhole cover with metal rungs set into the wall. I slipped my palms on the wet metal and climbed as silently as I could. I pressed against the cover at the top. It shifted, yet it felt heavy. I used more force, making a space that was just large enough to fit through. Somewhere in the city, I came out in an alley. I didn't know just where. Nothing appeared to be familiar. After repositioning the manhole cover, I took off running. I continued sprinting till I reached a crowded street with people on it. I didn't check my location on my phone until after that. In an unexpected direction, 6 blocks from Chinatown. 10 days have passed since then. I have kept what I witnessed to myself. I had been intruding, but identity fraud is a serious matter. I had gained access to restricted transit facilities. I may be the one in trouble if I went to the police. However, the size of the operation, the equipment, the document bins, the professional organization of everything, and the way that they discussed routes and shipments like this was just one location in a wider network are all things that keep coming to mind. My attention was drawn to the subway. After that, they looked for patterns for those who didn't seem to belong. And I saw something. Some people consistently show up at various stations at various times with the same kind of bag of grey duffel with a red stripe. Over the past week, I've noticed at least 6 different folks carrying these exact same bags. The trains are never used by them. They arrive at stations, vanish for 20 or 30 minutes, and then depart. I saw one of those at the Chinatown station yesterday. The grey duffel with the red stripe is being carried by a woman in her 30s. After passing through the turnstile, she made her way to the platforms. She went to the far end of the platform and slipped through a door marked authorized personnel only. However, rather than waiting for a train. I waited. 45 minutes later, she returned without the luggage. I was considering leaving the city after discovering something in my mailbox this morning. It was still a brand new transit card. It was not blank, though, in the plastic sleeve. Good for unlimited rides. Someone had scrawled in marker on the sleeve, "Take the Fairmont route. We are aware that you have been there previously." There was a picture in the envelope containing the card. It displayed everything I had observed, including the tunnel junction, the equipment tables, and the document bins. However, the picture was taken from a different perspective than mine. In the corner of the picture, just barely visible in the shadows, was the tiny cove where I had concealed myself. I could see my jacket's edge. They had been aware of my presence the entire time. Since I discovered the card, I have been keeping an eye on the entrance of my apartment complex. I noticed someone lingering across the street this afternoon. They never glanced at the screen of the phone they were carrying. Even though they appeared to be messaging, they were observing my structure. After 2 hours later, they called. Brief discussion. After that, they left. They were replaced by someone else 10 minutes later. Same behavior, different individual. In shifts, they're watching. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unidentified number tonight. Discretion is valued by the organization. Despite seeing something you shouldn't have, you said nothing. That demonstrates sound judgment. Someone with sound judgment would be helpful. Tomorrow at 6 o'clock. Station in Chinatown. Make use of the card we sent. On the platform, you'll meet someone. Now I have the transportation card in my hands. Flipping it over, I have a want to destroy it. Act as though I never got it. I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't turn up. They are aware of my residence. 4 days, if not longer. They had been observing me. They don't want me to meet them, and they have my tunnel photo. They tell me it's Tuesday tomorrow. It is 17 hours before 6 p.m. I'm not sure what they're looking for. But I keep thinking about the bags being carried through the subway system, the bins full of IDs and passports, the routes they described, and what happens to those who refuse to participate because they see too much. I just got another text. You have 16 hours and 42 minutes to make a choice. Make an informed decision. A few people join the group. Others are included in the shipment. The individual is still observing my building from the other side of the street. They're anticipating my next move.